Good morning and welcome. Welcome, everybody. Today we are here for CBC's Booked at the Vancouver Public Library event. I am Jonna, and I'm very happy to be bringing you this program today from my home, which is located on the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. The Vancouver Public Library is also located on the stolen homelands of those people. And when we acknowledge the land, we really hope that it's an opportunity for all of us to reflect on the ongoing history of colonialism in our country and genocide, and consider the ways that we can each further incorporate anti-racism and decolonization into improving our communities. To find out whose land you're watching from, please visit us or please visit the website that my colleague Amira has posted in the chat, whose.land/en/. You'll see the slide there of what it looks like. If you're joining us today from outside of Vancouver, you can discover the history of the land that you're on by just simply typing in your community name. As you can see, we've got Michelle Good is joining us today along with Cheryl, and we're going to be discussing her novel, Five Little Indians. Now, if you have any questions for the author throughout the course of the webinar, feel free to pop those into the chat. There might be an opportunity for Michelle to answer them during the course of the program. So without further ado, we are delighted to have Cheryl McKay from CBC's North by Northwest here today. Welcome, Cheryl. And hello.
There we go. I'll unmute myself. Thanks so much, Jonna. Thank
Mhm.
you. It's terrific to be here, and I'm so excited about this conversation to come with Michelle Good. And you just had the photo of her beautiful book, 10 Little Indians, up there. And I only have a couple of the prize badges on here, but right now, if you get a copy, they're all the way across the top, because this book has won the Governor General's Award for Literary Fiction. The Amazon First Novel Award was on the long list and the short list for all the top awards. Michelle is of Cree ancestry. She's a descendant of the Battle River Cree and a member of the Red Pheasant Cree Nation. She's a lawyer, and she's worked for many years in the public and the private sector, primarily advocating for survivors of residential school. Went back to school at some point and took a creative writing degree at the University of British Columbia, and that result, this amazing novel, her first novel, What a Start. I am so delighted to have this chance to have a conversation with Michelle Good. So Michelle, please join us now. Hello.
Hi there. I thought for a minute that I would just put on my mic and say, no.
And then where would we be?
And where would we be? So, but, thank you for having me. I really, really enjoy the opportunity to speak with readers, avid readers on any subject, and readers that are engaged in the book right now. It's really awesome. But I'll start by saying that the objective of using this particular title was successfully demonstrated in your introduction. You called it 10 Little Indians.
Did I really? Oh, my soul.
Yes. And, but it's wonderful. I was so happy to hear that, because that was, this title just came to me one day. It had several working titles, and it came to me, and I thought, oh, this is so perfect, because I've got my 5 protagonists, right? And with that title, it's a reference to that horrible racist little ditty, 1 little 2 little 3 little Indians. And so what I wanted with that title is for everybody that looked at it to go, yes, this is a story about a system based in racism. So you've demonstrated the successful choice of that. Thank you.
It's so funny. I even, it's a title that is even sort of uncomfortable to say, whether you get it right or not,
Yes. Yeah. And, but it's really interesting, because as you said, this is my first novel, and one person that I talked about the title to had that, really? Can you say that? And I said, yeah, I can. As can Thomas King with his Inconvenient Indian, and,
Right.
Indians on Vacation, and so on and so forth. But, the other thing to consider is that at the time that the novel starts, in the 60s and 70s, there was no, people were just starting to, accommodate and to refer to us as natives. But there was no Aboriginal, there was no Indigenous, there was no recognition of individual nations and so on. So it's also reflective of the time. So, yeah.
Michelle, before we get to talk more about Five Little Indians, I would love to talk to you about, this has been such a time, the Amazon First Novel Award, the Governor General's Award, these various, the Writers Trust and other long lists and short lists. What was it like for you as a first-time novelist to have this kind of, I don't know, success, accolade, however you like to describe it?
Well, when I wrote this book and it first won the UBC HarperCollins Fiction Prize, and that's, how it got published. HarperCollins picked it up from there. That's what you win, publication. And, I thought, oh, this is so great. I was so happy. And, but my expectation was that this would be very well received as a niche book by a niche audience. The notion that this would have this incredibly broad response, it has been really mind-boggling. And I don't think it's actually really settled in that, it won, it was nominated for 3 prizes on one day, the GG, the Amazon, and the Kobo emerging writer. And the book won all 3 of those. And and then was, a runner-up, a finalist for the Writers Trust, the long list, and the Giller. And I'm just, what? I still feel a little sort of that kind of pinch me moment, right? Really? So, but really, ultimately, when I consider all of that, the most meaningful thing about awards like these are that it raises the profile of the book in the consciousness of readers. And maybe one more person, 10 more people, 100 more people will read the book and, will give some reconsideration to what they think they know about residential schools and its impacts.
When you mentioned you thought initially that this would be a book that might appeal to a niche audience, Michelle, who was the audience that you were thinking of?
Well, I was thinking about people like myself, who are intergenerational survivors or lawyers or survivors themselves, or people that have been involved in the process of resolving claims, or historians that are interested in these kinds of things. But as I say, it's a very happy surprise that it seems to be sort of kind of an equal opportunity book. Everybody from every kind of walk of life. I've had people track me down and send me emails, and I've had emails from teachers and judges and therapists and just every walk of life that you can imagine that have really been moved by the book. And so that's just fabulous. Yeah.
Michelle, had you always planned to write? Was that always something that you were just, I don't know, eager to do, aching to do?
Yeah, I've had a couple of conversations with Wabgishik Rice, a couple of, festivals and where we've had a conversation, and that question comes up a fair bit. But I've been talking to him about how I think writers are made. They're, well, not made. Writers are born. They're not made. And I think of that, particularly in our storytelling tradition, the oral tradition, that there were, traditionally people who were identified as having that potential of being storytellers and brought along to play that very important role of passing on the stories, which are the history and the traditions of people. And, I was just a really weird little kid. I really was, probably from the time I was around 11, I was never without one of those little black journals, right? And I would just, but what we do as writers, right? We observe, we consider, we record. And that's really been a huge part of my life. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of what you've done with your law practice, your law work as well, right?
Yes, yeah, there's writing in all of that. And,
And
I've been
written.
writing poetry for, as long as I can remember as well. And yeah, so it's me. Yes.
I just have a question here. Jonna, I'm just saying, let me just say that again for the recording, but Jonna is standing by and she's taking some questions from people who are watching. And I think, Jonna, you have something that you'd like to present right now?
Yes, hi. So this is a question coming from Richard Burkholder, and it's a question for Michelle. He says, "Hi, Michelle, I loved your book, a brilliant read. My question is your decision to place such a difficult chapter and the death of one of the characters so early on in the book. It was such a difficult read and I almost didn't continue, but so glad I did."
I'm really glad you did too. And I'll before I specifically answer that question, because those first three chapters are so rough, and they're kind of, even though they're the beginning of the book, they're transitional chapters for the characters, because they're leaving the school, they're sort of finding their feet or not finding their feet in those early days after they've left the school. And that was why I wrote the prologue. The prologue came after the entire book had been edited, with HarperCollins, with my editor at HarperCollins, and two editors. We had a conversation and they said, "We think you should maybe do a prologue because those first three chapters are so rough. We need to sort of plant some seeds of hope right at the beginning so people won't, have too much difficulty in proceeding." But the other reason that I had that chapter and that character, who, spoiler alert, who isn't one of the characters that makes it, was I wanted it to be, I wanted the idea that residential schools, attendance at and survival of, was a life and death experience for Indigenous children. And the best way, I felt, to demonstrate that was to have it right up front, where we have one of the characters who is dying because of the impacts of the school. And I know it's rough. I'm sorry. But I think that the book is balanced. I think that there is a lot of love and hope and resilience and strength in the book, as well as the trauma and the hardship.
Michelle, your family has had terrible experience with residential school through the generations. What effects do you see in your family from that experience?
Well, my mother learned in residential school that her indigeneity was an invitation to violence and brutality. She learned that very, very early on. And I believe that her residential school experience played a key role in her choice about who she would marry. And it sounds like, how is that a harm? How is that an impact? Well, my mother married a non-Indigenous man, and the law was such at the time that she lost her Indigenous status, her Indian status, because of that. And that's how the law was. And it was part of the, termination assimilation policy, because Indigenous women, if they married non-Indigenous men, they would lose their status and their children wouldn't have status. So you're taking people away from the community. But if Indigenous or non-Indigenous women married an Indigenous man, they legally became Indians. They could have been Portuguese and they would be on the books as Indian. And so the result of that is that me and my siblings were all born without access to our communities and without Indigenous status. And so, but I also feel quite strongly that that there was a degree of intention in that with my mother's choice, in that nobody could take her children away. Nobody could take her kids to residential school because they weren't Indians. So I'm
How old was she when she went?
9. And she didn't speak a word of English, and they weren't allowed to speak English. So she was constantly being punished because someone asks you a question, you can only respond to something in Cree. You can't. And so it was a very, very terrible time. She was only there for 4 years. I say only, I shouldn't,
Oh, yeah.
you know, but, you know, kids were legally, they could be held there until they were 16. But my mother contracted TB at the school, and she spent 3 years in a TB sanatorium. But she was an amazing woman, and the whole time she was in the TB sanatorium, she was writing letters to everybody that she could think of, saying, "I want an education. I want an education." It was illegal for Indians to get an education beyond grade 9 at that time. My mother got a scholarship and went to New Zealand and trained as a nurse and a midwife. In the 40s, in the 1940s, when you still had to get passes to leave the reserve, my mother was around the world.
What a woman.
It was up, yeah.
Actually, I want to correct something I said. I said she went. No, she was taken. There was no
voluntary aspect that you see in the word went. Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to go back and re-say that, because I realized, no, that's not what it was.
No.
You mentioned your mom having TB, and one of the characters, one of the side characters in this book, Lily, is a child who gets TB, and I understand that's a tribute to a real little girl.
It is. Lily was my mother's friend at residential school, and she hemorrhaged to death from tuberculosis on the playground in front of my mother and all these other little kids outside. And you know, my mom told me about that when I was very young. I was very young, like, you know, 11, 12, about that age. And that was when I was first starting to understand what my mother had experienced, because she used to refer to it as boarding school. And, you know, as avid reader that I was, you know, I'm reading about British boarding schools, Swiss boarding schools. And so my conception of what that meant was really different from what it was. And when she started talking to me about that, it was just this cognitive dissonance, in terms of trying to wrap my little head around, how could this have happened to my mother? You know, yeah, it was a very challenging thing. And I think because I had an idea of what it was, and then she gave me the reality of what it was, I think that played a huge role in sort of implanting this in my consciousness about something I had to be responsive to throughout my life, which I have been in different ways. Yeah.
You know, I must say that I've never really considered, I mean, in recent years, we've learned so much about conditions at residential schools and the horror of all that. But I'd never considered before, Michelle, what it was like for people, for students, after suddenly, like, they were gone. They were sent away. And as you write in this story, sent away with a nothing. They were just left with nothing and went back to families. And the families were often not at all what they'd been remembering because of the trauma of having the children taken. It's just, that was a part of it, Michelle, that I'd never really considered.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I wrote this book. That's what finally was the impetus to write this book, was just sheer exasperation and frustration and irritation at this ubiquitous question that would arise whenever anybody spoke about the impacts of residential school, and you'd see all the comments on media stories and so on. Why can't they just get over it? And it, you know, just so infuriating. It's like, oh, and you know, and so that's why I chose to write this about their lives after the school, as opposed to focusing on the time in the school, is because I wanted to give life to characters that could articulate what the harms were, what the injuries were, what the impacts and harms arising were, and how, you know, that tremendous burden of psychological injury impeded their ability to even have a modest life that resembles the lives that everybody expects to have, you know, with work, with training, with family, and so on. And that even all of these very, very basic things are a huge challenge to try to achieve. So that was the choice that I made and why I made it. Yeah.
Your character Lucy lands on the streets in Vancouver. She's had a life where she was holed away in the school before she was at home in a very different setting, and suddenly she's so vulnerable.
Yeah.
Landed in Vancouver with nothing and prey to whoever comes by.
Well, and you have to think about it. Like these many of these schools were extremely remotely located. They were never or rarely were they sort of close to a town, or some of them were on reserve lands, but they were remote for a reason, because the point of them was to separate kids from their families and communities. And so, and this one was on not an island like the one that I created was.
Right.
Not on an island, but a place where you could only get to by water, excuse me. And so from the time she's 6 till she's 16, 10 years, that's her whole life. Okay. She's never seen a mall. She's never seen a bus. She's never seen, a city bus. She's never seen a city. And so, this is like taking a child, a teenager that has the experience of a 5-year-old and dropping them in the city defenseless and without resources, and some people say that, yeah, the objective of the residential school system was assimilation. And I say, no, it was termination. It was genocide. Because if the objective had been to assimilate Indigenous people into, the broader Canadian society, where was the training? Where was the support? There were a couple of, I haven't read it yet, but there were a couple of people that worked in residential schools as childcare workers, and it was later. It was when the schools were starting to wind down. And they wrote and have spoken about their experiences and how they got fired for raising their concerns about what was happening to the kids and the way the kids were being treated. And, one of the things that they said was, there were no class lists. There were no records for these kids. There was no lesson planning. There was just nothing, and, Chief George Manuel, who was, an incredible political leader in British Columbia and nationally as well, he came out of residential school with a grade 3 education. And that's generally what you could expect, because the whole, there were 2 programs. The girls were in the domestic arts, so they could be maids and nannies. And the boys were, being groomed, if you will, to be manual laborers, if that, right? So, so if the intent had been this benevolent education to, just make it a, homogeneous population, where was the support? Where was the training? Wasn't there, because that wasn't the plan.
Michelle, you mentioned when your mom explained to you, and I'm not sure how old you were when she talked more about what her experience at residential school was like, that you'd imagined in a very different way.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking that then with your career, with your law career, that suddenly you were immersed in knowing or finding out about what that experience had been like for so many people.
Yeah. But, my law career came after many other things. I began working with Indigenous organizations when I was 18. And everybody that I worked with at that time, this was in the early to mid 70s when I began. And everybody that I worked with was, like the cohort of these characters. They were all residential school survivors. And, so I was, they were my cohort age-wise, and so on. And I had been in foster care for a period of time. So I shared some of the experiences that they had as well. But so this wasn't something that, I sort of had a life and then went to law school and then learned about this. This was my whole life, basically, from different perspectives, that I was immersed in the reality of this experience. And I didn't go to law school until I was 40.
Right.
Graduated when I was 43, and I went to work with a a law firm in Gastown in Vancouver that was an Aboriginal law firm. And I think it was a week after I was called to the bar, and another firm that they were cooperative with asked me if I would take on 5 residential school cases. And they were still in litigation then when, you know, people were having to be vigorously cross-examined in open court. It was just hideous, but I did, and that's where it began. Yeah.
What was the conversation like? You were mentioning when you were 18 and you were doing the work and you were meeting other people of your age who'd been in residential school. What was the conversation around that like then, Michelle?
You know, there wasn't a conversation. It was, you know, it was just the reality. You know, it's like, you know, let's just take an example of somebody that just goes to public school. Okay, they don't think of that as an experience so much. It's just their life. And, you know, and that was sort of what it was like as well. What was most apparent to me at the time, and again, it comes back to the impacts, right, is, you know, how different residential school survivors were from kids that I had gone to high school with, even though I didn't, you know, sort of maintain those relationships because of, you know, the whole foster care thing and so on and so forth. But I was aware immediately of how a different experience had a different outcome in terms of the quality of life of people. So yeah.
And did you see that difference in I guess their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations, or just in the way they thought about the world?
All of the above.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
I see there's another note here from Jonna about a question from a listener. Michelle, Jonna, are you there?
Hello, I am. I've got a question from Ada that says, I'm curious about the book stacked behind Michelle. Michelle, can you show us your bookshelf?
I gotta start putting these books away. I get this question every time.
You better be careful what you have out there.
I'm doing some just, they're mostly nonfiction. Well, they're all nonfiction. So it's about, you know, stuff I'm working on for my current book. But of course, A National Crime, which is something that I always try to refer readers to. It's by John S. Malloy. It is the most fantastic. It is about the residential school history, and that's all. It isn't one of those books where there's a chapter about res school and so on. And it's just a phenomenal history, and I recommend it to anybody that wants to educate themselves a little more. Somebody gave me a little grief once about referring to the residential schools as our Holocaust. You know, saying, wait a minute, you know, the Holocaust in the Second World War, millions of people were killed. And I said, well, it's not so different in North America. And so there's this fabulous book, which is called American Holocaust. It's by David Stannard, Stannard. And it is an excellent history about the impact of colonialism on the populations of Indigenous people in the Americas. And, you know, it's not only death by war, but death by pestilence and disease, and, you know, the impacts of, you know, poverty and the efforts, the colonial efforts to kill off what we made our living from, right? And so that's a really good book. Clearing the Plains by James Dashik is really another excellent history about the colonial times, and specifically the militaristic and political and legal efforts that were made to wipe Indigenous people out of the prairies. That's a big theme in my new book. Seeing Red. This is Seeing Red, A History of Natives in Canadian Newspapers, and it's about how the media has been complicit in creating a false image of Indigenous people, and it goes back to colonial times as well, but how that trend has continued into modern day. And A Narrow Vision, which is a study of Duncan Campbell Scott, genocide master. So So there's my books, okay?
That's a great bibliography right there.
It is a really good bibliography. Yeah, yeah, definitely.
I'd love to know about the characters, the 5 characters that we follow in this book. And I'm just wondering, did they all come for you at once, Michelle, or did you meet somebody first? Who came first?
Kenny, Kenny
Ah,
came
Kenny,
first.
the
Yeah,
wonderful Kenny.
yeah, that wonderful, sweet, terrible Kenny.
Brave. Oh,
Yeah, and the whole book started like I was still practicing law. I was still running my little law firm, and but I knew if I'm going to write a book, I'm going to have to get on it, right? So I was accepted into the MFA program at UBC, and what a time that was.
talk
So,
about too much to do. Oh, my soul.
oh my goodness, yeah. I mean, sometimes I give people example. One time, I had 13 hearings in 4 different geographical locations over 16 days.
Oh,
Yeah, and that went on for about 4 years at that pace. It was just, yeah, crazy. But anyway, so I'm in a workshop, and we had an exercise that we were given to do, and I wrote a paragraph, and it was a paragraph about Kenny, and it was about Kenny in the dorm, and the crying of all the little kids in the dorm, which so many survivors talk about that, about little kids crying themselves to sleep at night. And so then came Kenny. And then when I developed that paragraph into the first chapter of the book, it was in the school. And so he had to have people in the school that he was relating to.
right.
And that's where little Lucy came from, was through him relating to somebody else in the school. And one of my secondary characters, Wilfred, as well, right, who he reconnects with later on. And then, you know, then Lucy leaves, and then Lucy has to, we had to bring in Maisie so that Lucy could have somebody to go to in the city. And, and they just developed in that way, right? Where but the other thing about it was, as soon as I wrote that paragraph about Kenny, I knew I was going to need a bunch of more characters. Because, I mean, not just to tell the story, but, well, I guess it is to tell the story, but to be able to articulate the scope and the type of harms and impacts that um, that survivors experienced, I would need more than one person. Otherwise, it would have just been, a person that never had a good day in their life, right? If it was just one character, right? It was just, so that concept was there early on, but the characters themselves just came out of the writing. It came out of, okay, well, now she's in the city. Okay, we've got some other girls that are working at the Manitou, and, so on and so forth. So it grew that way.
Kenny's so tragic. He's so brilliant and brave and curious and filled with life. And he it's so he's so damaged and destroyed by that terrible experience.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, he's this just this amazing, determined boy when we first meet him, that he's going to get out of there one way or another. He's going to go, and he becomes like this epic guy for the rest of the kids. He gives hope to the other kids, right? Because he never gives up. And ultimately he escapes, and the school tells the other kids he drowned, and but they don't believe it, and they just keep mythologizing Kenny. But that trend, and it's the same thing with Maisie. Some people have said with Maisie that it refers to prostitution or sex work, and it doesn't. That's not what it is. What it is Maisie, under a compulsion to revisit her trauma in an effort to try and resolve it. And it's the same thing with Kenny. It's a very, very common symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder is, that you just keep running and running and running. And that's, and none of these kids had the benefit of, therapeutic intervention or support or any of those kinds of things. So they just manage their symptoms as best they can.
Makes me think, when you're saying that, makes me think about the characters of George and Vera, And
Mhm.
also, and I've lost her name right now, but the wise woman,
Mariah.
Mariah, thank you.
Yeah.
And I was so grateful when those characters came in to help some.
Yeah.
Was
Well,
that, did you always
and
know they'd be there?
when Clara started developing as an activist, um, I was going to bring in the American Indian movement. And as soon as I did that, as soon as I made that decision, what that did is it broadened the scope of the book in terms of secondary characters to elucidate something else that was going on at that time, which was an Indigenous Renaissance, if you will, with the Trail of Tears, with, the Trail of Broken Treaties, the takeover of Alcatraz, Wounded Knee, all of those things that were going on in this cultural renaissance that really was the foundation of all of the things that you see happening today in the effort to reestablish our self-determination and our identity as Indigenous people. And so there were these trailblazers back then, like George and Vera, right, that were seeking the traditional ways of knowing and the spiritual teachings and so on and so forth. And Clara was just really fortunate to run into them through the Friendship Center and to find the help she needed with their friend, with Mariah, the healer. Yeah.
As you say that, I'm just thinking of, as you say, this has been your decades too, that your experience through,
Yeah.
right? Did you need to get a drink of water or something?
Who, me?
Yeah, I just saw you looking around. I thought you were looking for your glass of water.
Oh, no, I was just, no, don't mind me. No, I'm fine. Thank you. Um,
And
and
I was
yes,
just thinking, yeah, just wondering what it was like for you, going from the point where nobody was recognizing what had happened or what was happening to this growth in awareness and activism.
yeah. Well, that was my time. And I mean, it was a time when, people say to me, oh, nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. Well, I'm old enough now that I can say, no, some things have changed. And it's been largely through our efforts, through our activism and our advocacy and our insistence on certain things. But back then, and I mean, this was part of our activism, is that if a child anywhere in the province graduated from grade 12, it was cause for this massive celebration and acknowledgement and those kinds of things, because it was so rare at that time. And like I think I said earlier, right around that time, people were still calling us Indians and natives, and the constitutional protections and changes hadn't occurred. um, and as you say, the awareness of how things actually transpired with residential school was virtually nil, right? So, and but the other kind of fun part of this, if there can be something that's fun about this, is um, that, yeah, I was a teenager. This was my life in Vancouver. I had just aged out of foster care. I had some of the experiences that these kids have in terms of, trying to find work and, predation and, the racism and all of those kinds of things. And so, and also creating the world that the book takes place in. It was awesome because all I had to do was go back into my memory bank movies, right? And, just call on my own memories, my own experiences to help, create that world that the book takes place in. So, my new book starts in 1856. I wasn't there, so it's a whole different process.
Yes, you evoke Fourth Avenue and that era, and
Yeah.
what we now say is the downtown East Side. Like just
Yeah.
such a different time. Yeah.
Well, in all those sort of iconic places in the downtown East Side, like the only seafood restaurant, right, where the kids always go for cheap soup, right, and the Two J's Cafe, right, and some of the pubs and hotels, the old derelict hotels, and so on. Yeah. So yeah, it was an interesting time, that's for sure.
What was it like for you writing this, aside from the fun of delving into that, but immersing yourself in your writing in this world too?
Um, there were times when it was really personally devastating, right? And um, because you really had to assume the demeanor of suffering people in order to be able to communicate it. And, so there were times when I really had to set it aside for sometimes months, because it was very traumatizing in a way. And it brings up all kinds of feelings that are not productive, like just, rage and frustration and just all of those kinds of things when you're walking through those realities again. And yeah, so there were quite a few times. Well, it took 9 years to write the thing, so there were many times that I had to set it aside. So yeah.
Were you drawing sometimes on the experiences in a very oblique way of people you'd heard from over the years too?
um in an oblique way, I guess, I mean, in the sort of generic sense, right? That, these were, um, experiences that virtually everybody had that went to residential schools. But, I'd also read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of psychological assessments, um, both in terms of, my advocacy for survivors and also in just other legal work and so on. And, boy, what a learning experience that was, I tell you. And so, I was really informed by all of that as well in terms of the impacts of this kind of childhood trauma.
How have you kept yourself safe through all this?
What do you mean?
I mean, having to, well, with your work and with your advocacy, just hearing the story after story with your own family history and the trauma that's come to you, I'm just wondering how you've managed to deal with that, Michelle.
Well, it's been a lot of work. It's been absolutely a lot of work. And I have colleagues that, also represented survivors. And, you know, it's not an exaggeration to say that many people advocating for survivors suffered from secondary trauma. Listening to these stories day after day after day after day. Um, and especially, I think, I mean, well, maybe not, like for Indigenous advocates such as myself, like it's just being stabbed through the heart over and over and over again when you hear about the things that happened. And some of them experiences that I'm aware of that, make my book seem mild. Okay. And so from that, Indigenous perspective, that real sort of, ooh, but non-Indigenous advocates as well that just had no clue of the extent of the abuses and the harms and so on that are, they continue to sort of suffer from the trauma of doing that work. Yeah. Yeah. But you got to find help wherever you can. And, you know, I'm a looking forward kind of person. I always have been. It's like the past is in the past and just eyes forward, eyes forward. So,
With that in mind, I think I saw a note going by here from one of our viewers who was curious about whether or not you have a title for your next book.
um, I do, but it's a working title, and I don't think that it will ultimately end up being the title of the book. Um, but it's based on my great grandmother. It's loosely based on my great grandmother, who was born in 1856. I was born in 1956, so I like that little symmetry there. It's kind of cool. Um, but the really interesting thing about my grandmother is that she never laid eyes on a non-Indigenous person until she was in her late teens, potentially even 20-ish. And so what I have in her in the foundation for a character that she is to me is a pre-colonial Indigenous woman.
Hmm.
And so I'm going to be writing about that very volatile time in the history of what was the Northwest Territories, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and how a pre-contact Indigenous woman would experience that.
Hmm.
And so, that was very volatile. It's the time of the Métis resistance. It's the time of the Cree chiefs and their resistance to limitations being proposed by treaty. And, this is the time my great grandmother was chased across the border with Big Bear's band after the Frog Lake so-called massacre. And ended up in Rocky Boy Reserve in Montana, who accepted them there. There was an amnesty, and they were permitted to come back to Canada. They're all put in a boxcar. Does that remind you of anything? And then they were shipped back to Alberta. And to this day, there is a reserve in Alberta that is known as the Montana Band of Cree. And that's where my great-grandmother ended up. My grandfather ultimately brought her back to Saskatchewan. And so it's going to be that whole story, and how the foundations of the notion of Indigenous women as disposable developed over those years. And so I'll be telling that story again through her eyes and her experiences. So in a nutshell, that's what I hope to accomplish.
What an epic.
It seems that, epic is my genre. Right? So, yeah. So
But-
anyway, yeah.
And Michelle, as you say that, I'm just so struck again by how there is an opening on that history that we don't hear, right? We don't hear from that perspective.
Well, and that's the truth. I mean, that is the real truth, and that's the point, right? Is that, Winston Churchill once said, "Gentlemen, history will be kind to us because I intend to write it." Okay, and that's what we have in Canadian history. Is we have the history of this part of North America through a colonial lens. What we don't have is history through an Indigenous lens. And, I've got a little bit of that in, Five Little Indians, and there'll be a lot of that in the book that I'm working on right now. Somebody asked a question about why I was in foster care, and I'm okay to answer that question. Thank you, everybody who said, "Oh dear." But I am prepared to answer that question, and I am, because it relates to my mother's injuries that arose from residential school. My mother was wonderful. My family was wonderful and strong. We were a very strong family. I was apprehended because I was sexually assaulted when I was 13 years old and wasn't able to tell anybody about it. And the reason that I ended up in the company of this person, he was somebody that I asked me if I would babysit for him and his wife on New Year's Eve. And I was trying to raise money to buy myself a guitar, and I was all excited about it. And my mother didn't trust him. She said, "No, I have to meet, I don't know who this is. I have to meet them." And so he came to the house, and I knew right there that my mother just did not trust this guy. All her spidey sense was going off, but I persisted. "It's okay, Mom, can I please, please, please," right? And then for that reason, I felt that what happened was my fault. But I believe that my mother allowed it. She overrode her own sense of this is not a good thing by what she learned in residential school, is that you say yes to the white man. And so in that sort of peripheral way, I think that's part of why that happened to me. And so, that question also provides an opening for, how I could relate to the harms that arise from these kinds of abuses that res school survivors experience. So,
And how it played out in your family.
yeah, and in my life, to this day, right? Yeah.
I see that we're just about out of time. Jonna, I wonder if there are any other questions that you'd like to pose from listeners right now, or viewers?
Sure thing. I do have a question here that is from Anna. Anna says, Michelle, I'm enjoying listening to you. You're a wonderful storyteller without me having read your book yet. Can you please tell us a little bit more about yourself? What do you do for fun?
I write books. Oh, no, fun. Gee, what's that? Well, I love music. I make music, and I have two dogs that really keep me busy, and I just love their natural sweetness. And yeah, so music, books, that's me.
Dogs, yeah.
Dogs, yeah.
You know, when you mentioned about going back to do the masters in writing, more in the Masters of Fine Arts at UBC, and you
Mhm.
said, well, if I'm going to do it, I've got to do it now. So this is something, like you say, as a child, you were carrying around notebooks sometimes and you were an avid reader.
Yeah.
Was it something that you imagined would happen to you at some day, that you would be writing a novel?
I've been threatening to write a book for decades. I mean, and literally, like I would have, this, a moment of frustration about, one aspect or another of injustices as it pertains to Indigenous people. And I'm going to write a book. I don't know how many times when I was working at the Department of Justice, I would tell everybody, I'm going to write a book, right? So, I mean, I wanted to be a lawyer when I was in grade 6.
Hmm.
I That was in my head. I don't know why. I didn't know any lawyers. My parents didn't know any lawyers, right? And but that was in my head when I was in grade 6. And also, it's really interesting because when I was 13, I had something happen, and a friend of mine just reminded me of this about, I don't know, maybe 5, 6 years ago. And she said, do you remember when you and I ran into each other and you were upset because of blah, blah? And you said to me, but that's okay because I'm going to leave this town and I'm going to write books. I'm going
When
to
you
be
were
a writer.
13.
Yeah. And it was really interesting because for her, she that was her aha moment. I grew up in a company town. That was her aha moment, that women, because all we were then was teachers and nurses, right? That women could make choices outside of those. And then she went on to become this phenomenal filmmaker. Yeah. So yeah, it's
So
always
great.
been part of the thing. Yeah.
I noticed that somebody put a comment in there about the dogs in the book too. Michelle, you were talking about your dogs, and dogs are certainly a wonderful presence in the book
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. Well, John Lennon. John Lennon was actually a real dog. I was working with an Indigenous community in the northeast of BC, and the chief's mother had two dogs, John Lennon and Yoko. And so, actually, throughout the book, I'm not going to sort of go into a lot of detail, but there are little homages to, different people, different experiences, different memories, and so on, right through the book. And when my friend, who was the chief at the time, read that and read about John Lennon, it was like, whoa. Yeah, yeah.
Have,
So
have your friends found all of those yet? Have you heard from everybody
I,
about?
not everybody, but I have heard from people. And, John Lennon was also a very important character in the book because Clara spent so much time alone, either literally or alone with other people. And if we didn't have John Lennon, then so much of what she thought and, decided and felt just wouldn't have been there. And so John Lennon is a very, very important character in the book. Yeah.
He became her primary relationship, her first reliable relationship, really, right?
That's exactly correct. Yeah.
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 When you sit down now to write, or as you're sitting down to write the new book, with all of the things that have happened with Five Little Indians, does it does it feel at all daunting now, Michelle?
Yes. But I shouldn't, I'm going to say no.
Okay.
It was when I first sat down to start writing the new book. Um, it was like, oh my God, like what, I'll never be able to do this again. And, so I stopped feeling daunted about it. I just said, oh, just stop it, right? You wrote this book, just write your book. you know, what happens to the book is incidental to the fact of the book. And, you know, this is a story I need to tell. I'm going to tell it, and what happens, happens. So, you know, and I have, you know, so many writing friends that I can, you know, share drafts and ideas and, um, you know, any kind of challenges that I might face in writing and so on. And, you know, so I'll just write the book. What happens to it? And I, you know, somebody sent me an email and said, you know, your book has inspired me to tell my story. I said, awesome. You know, how do you get it published? And I said, don't even think about publishing. Don't, right? That's not the point. The point is to tell the story. So write the story, then worry about publishing. And so I'm taking that advice myself, like write the story, then worry about, you know, how it's received, right? Or don't worry about it at all. Just tell the story.
Just have that experience. Yeah. Before we wrap up here, I think we've got 2 minutes left. Michelle, is there anything that you wanted to add that I haven't given you a chance to mention at all?
Just, you know, that I really encourage people to, you know, to reach out to the many resources that are available now that might assist us as an entire population, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, in terms of reconciliation. And, you know, the burial sites that are being found now, to me, I mean, we've known about this forever. Indigenous people have known about it forever. But it's new to non-Indigenous Canada. And I see that as a kind of reckoning. And reckoning to me is the truth part of Truth and Reconciliation. And once non-Indigenous Canadians can really, really grasp that these schools were a life and death experience, either in the school or when you left the school so harmed, then I think we will be in a position where we can be on level ground to meet for reconciliation.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much for this time. It's been such a privilege and a pleasure to have this hour with you. Really appreciate it.
Well, you know, I love talking to readers. I just love it. So I'm really pleased to be here, and thank you for having me.
And thanks to everybody at the VPL, to Leah and Jonna and Amara. Thank you for making these possible. And this will be, a lot of this conversation will show up on North by Northwest. Bye for now. Bye.
Thank you.
Michelle, that was fabulous. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I don't know if we're still live, but
I was looking forward, after our little tiny chat the other day, I got to say, I was looking forward so much, and how great. I can't wait till we can do it again.
yeah, well, you know, me too. So you have a really great day, okay? And we'll talk again soon, no doubt.
Bye.
Bye-bye.